Imagine a single sentence, 6 words, spoken by a stranger over a radio. And because of those 6 words, you slow down, merge left, and avoid a speed trap you never would have seen coming. You didn't know that person. You'll never meet them, but they were watching out for you. That's what a single channel on a citizens band radio did for an entire decade. And here's the part that almost nobody talks about. The reason that channel exists at all comes down to one specific problem, one specific date, and a slogan so simple it spread across an entire country without a single advertisement, without a press release, without any authority telling anyone to do a thing. This is the story of why that number is 19. And it starts with a different number entirely. Before the fall of 1973, the highway channel wasn't 19, it was 10. Channel 10 was where the truckers lived, where the four-wheelers tuned in, where you heard the first crackling voices when you clicked your radio on somewhere past a rest stop in the middle of a long, empty state. It was crowded, it was loud, and it worked well enough. Most people didn't question it. 10 was 10 because 10 had always been 10. Nobody had sat in a committee room and decided it. It had just settled there, organically, the way people always drift to the same corner of a room without being told to. But there was a problem building quietly underneath all of that noise. And to understand the problem, you have to understand what was sitting right next to Channel 10 on the dial. Channel 9 had been officially designated by the FCC in 1969 as the emergency channel. The idea was straightforward. If you had an accident on the highway, if your car broke down in a blizzard, if somebody in your vehicle needed medical help, you keyed up on Channel 9 and someone would answer. A network of volunteer teams had organized specifically around that promise. They monitored Channel 9 around the clock. They relayed distress calls to local police and highway patrol. They were the human layer, sitting between a driver in trouble and the help that driver needed. Think about what it meant to have that in 1970. There were no cell phones. There were no roadside call boxes on most stretches of highway. If your engine seized at 2 in the morning on a rural interstate in Wyoming, your options were to wait and hope someone stopped, or to reach into the glove box and key up on Channel 9 and pray somebody was listening. Those volunteers made sure somebody was always listening. What they were doing was genuinely life-saving, in the most literal sense of that word. Now put that right next to Channel 10 on the dial, one channel apart, and fill Channel 10 with hundreds of truckers and road drivers all keying up at the same time, all talking over each other, all pushing signal out into the air simultaneously. What happens to Channel 9? The answer is called splatter, adjacent channel interference. When a radio transmits with enough signal strength, some of that energy bleeds sideways into neighboring frequencies. It doesn't go far, but it doesn't need to go far. One channel away is close enough. Emergency calls on Channel 9 were getting drowned out. Real distress calls were being lost in the noise coming off Channel 10. Someone calling for help after an accident couldn't be heard because 100 truckers were all talking at once about a speed trap they'd just passed. That was the problem. Concrete, specific, dangerous. And here is where the story gets interesting, because nobody in a government building solved it. No FCC official issued a directive, no trucking association voted on a resolution. What happened instead was this. A group of people who understood the problem decided to fix it themselves. And they came up with a solution so elegant that it didn't need enforcement, didn't need a rule book, and didn't need to convince a single bureaucrat. Move everyone from Channel 10 to Channel 19. Why 19? That's the question worth sitting with for a moment. Not 11, not 12, not any of the intervening channels. 19 specifically. And the answer is threefold. First, 19 sits far enough from 9 that the bleed-over problem disappears. Put enough distance between the busy highway channel and the emergency channel, and the splatter can't reach. Second, 19 happens to fall in a particularly strong part of the 27 megahertz band for range and signal clarity, which mattered practically for drivers trying to pass information across distance at highway speeds. Third, And this is the part that made everything work. The date lined up perfectly. October 19th, written the American way, 10/19. Channel 10 to Channel 19 on 10/19. The slogan wrote itself. 19 on the 19th. Move from 10 to 19 on the 19th. It was, by any measure, one of the more quietly brilliant pieces of grassroots communication in American radio history. It asked nothing complicated of anyone. It required no equipment upgrade, no retraining, no purchase. It just asked people to reach forward on the dial by 9 clicks on a specific date. The word went out through truck stops and roadside diners and live on-air conversations for weeks leading up to the date. Not through television, not through newspapers, not through any organized media campaign. Just voice to voice, handle to handle, across the open air. Someone in a booth at a diner in Ohio told a driver sitting 2 stools over. That driver keyed up somewhere in Indiana and passed it along. A woman monitoring Channel 9 heard about it and told her husband, who drove long haul out of Tennessee. It moved the way rumors move through a close community, which is exactly what the CB world was at that point, before it became something larger. On October 19th, 1973, the switch happened. And 2 days before that, the world had given it a reason to matter more than anyone could have anticipated. October 17th, 1973, the Arab oil embargo. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries cut off oil exports to the United States in response to American military support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The announcement landed like a stone dropped in still water. The ripples moved fast. Gas prices began climbing within days. Fuel shortages followed. Lines stretched around blocks at stations that still had supply. Stations that ran dry by mid-morning put signs out by afternoon. The country had never experienced anything quite like it, and the drivers who felt it first and hardest were the ones spending the most time on the road. For independent truckers, the situation was not an inconvenience. It was a livelihood crisis. They ran on diesel. They were paid by the mile, and the miles were becoming impossible to complete without fuel that was becoming impossible to find. And then, on January 2nd, 1974, President Nixon signed the Emergency Highway Energy Conservation Act into law, setting a national maximum speed limit of 55 miles per hour across every major highway in the country. The argument was conservation. The effect, for a trucker paid by the distance covered, was a straight cut in earning potential. Run slower, cover less ground, make less money. The math was that simple and that painful. What had been a modest community tool became, almost overnight, a survival network. Channel 19, which had just made its debut as the new highway standard on October 19, 1973, was perfectly positioned to absorb everything that followed. Think about the timing for a moment. The channel switch happened at the exact moment the crisis that would define CB radio's decade of dominance was beginning. The two events did not cause each other, but they collided in a way that made each one more powerful than it would have been alone. Channel 19 became the highway channel precisely when the highway became the front line of an economic and energy emergency that tens of millions of Americans were trying to navigate in real time. What did that look like in practice? Picture a fuel stop somewhere in the Texas Panhandle in late 1973. A driver pulls in, gets the last load of diesel available, and before he's back on the road, he's keying up to let everyone within range know that the next station east is dry, and the one after that closed at noon. Someone else breaks in from the opposite direction with news about a station 30 miles north that opened a new delivery. A third voice cuts through with the price. That information was worth something real, not emotionally, not symbolically, practically. Concretely in dollars and hours and the difference between making a delivery and sitting on the shoulder waiting for a truck to come. The language that developed around this system is worth understanding on its own terms because it wasn't decoration, it was compression. Every term existed to move information faster than plain speech could carry it. A state trooper was a bear. A patrol car running radar was a Smokey with a camera. An overpass with an officer watching was a bear in the air. A way station was a chicken coop. Closed was clean. Open and checking trucks was wall to wall. The road conditions ahead were the front door. The road behind you were the back door. You gave a driver a time check by saying, "What's your 20?" And they came back with a location without ever slowing down to spell out a county name. The whole vocabulary was built for speed, built for one hand on a microphone and both eyes on the road. You picked this up the way you pick up the rhythm of a new neighborhood, not by studying it, by being in it. Children in back seats learned it passively. Teenagers who got their first mobile unit wired it themselves and had the slang down within a week of scanning the dial. Families with a base station at home and a mobile unit in the car used it the way later generations would use a second phone line. You weren't out of reach. You weren't unreachable. You were on the air, and the air connected everything. But here's the thing about Channel 19 that made it different from everything that came before it, or beside it. It wasn't a network that someone had built. It wasn't infrastructure that someone had financed or maintained or controlled. It was a frequency, an open piece of spectrum that anyone with a $30 radio could access, and the only thing that held the whole arrangement together was a shared agreement that this was where everyone would be. That agreement had no legal weight. No one could enforce it. It persisted entirely because it was useful, and because enough people chose to honor it that it became self-reinforcing. That is a rarer thing than it sounds. Most communication systems require some form of central authority. A telephone network needs switching infrastructure. A broadcast network needs a transmitter and a license and a tower. Channel 19 needed none of that. It needed only the collective decision of enough drivers to stay on the same frequency, and that decision had been made on October 19th, 1973, by people who had no idea how large what they were building would eventually become. By the mid-1970s, the scale had become genuinely difficult to describe without numbers. By 1977, the FCC was processing CB license applications by the hundreds of thousands. The original 23-channel band plan was straining under the volume of users. In that same year, the Commission expanded the available frequencies to 40 channels, trying to give the growing population of users more room to breathe. Channel 19 stayed exactly where it was. In a world that had just doubled in width, it remained the center of gravity. Everyone knew where it was. Everyone knew what it was for. You didn't tune around looking for conversation on Channel 19. You tuned to Channel 19, and the conversation was already there. Walk into any Radio Shack in 1976 and look at what was on display. Units priced under $100, a figure closer to $450 in today's money, and the shelves were restocking faster than they could be filled. The equipment had moved from a specialized purchase to an expected household item in less time than a single political term. People were installing them in pickup trucks, family sedans, the occasional station wagon with a long antenna fixed to the roof that tilted slightly in the wind at highway speed. At its peak in 1979, estimates put the number of CB radios in active use somewhere between 20 and 30 million units. 14 million licensed users. A culture had formed so quickly and so thoroughly that it produced its own films, its own hit songs, its own celebrity figures with handles instead of names. A country song built entirely around CB slang and trucker life hit #1 on the pop charts in January 1976. Movies followed. The whole thing had broken out of the radio and into the wider cultural conversation in a way that nobody in 1973 could have predicted when they were debating which channel to make the new highway standard. And through all of it, Channel 19 held. Not because anyone enforced it, because the convention was too useful to abandon, and because the community that had formed around it was too real to dissolve quickly. A trucker in California and a trucker in Maine were strangers in every sense of that word except one. They were both on 19. That shared tuning was a form of identity as much as it was a practical communication choice. But something was already shifting in the background that most people couldn't see yet. Two things, actually. The first was structural, and it came from inside the trucking industry itself. In 19, federal deregulation dismantled the regulatory framework that had governed trucking since 1935. Fixed routes and fixed rates were gone. Carriers were competing against each other on price and efficiency for the first time in generations. What you were hauling, where you were going, what rate you'd agreed to take, that information had economic value now, and it was being broadcast on Channel 19 to everyone within range every time a driver keyed up. The openness that had been the point was now a liability. The industry needed private lines. Channel 19 couldn't give them that. The second was slower and came from outside. The first commercial cellular telephone network went live in October 1903 in Chicago. The handsets cost close to $4,000. Nobody at a truck stop was seriously thinking about one. But prices on technology fall on a curve that tends to be steep once the infrastructure is in place. By the early 1990s, mobile phones had reached ordinary households. By the end of that decade, they were expected. And a mobile phone did something Channel 19 was structurally incapable of doing. It gave you a private line, a direct connection to one specific person, not a broadcast to everyone within 5 miles, a call that only 2 people heard. That gap, the privacy gap, was what finally pulled people away. Not because Channel 19 stopped working, it kept working fine, but the specific problems it had been the best available solution for were finding better solutions elsewhere. A trucker who needed dispatch to know his location didn't need to announce it to every other driver on the road. A wife waiting for her husband to call from the highway didn't need to have the base unit on and hope he was close enough to reach her. The direct call replaced the broadcast because the direct call did more with less. By the middle of the 1990s, Channel 19 had contracted back toward the core community it had served before the boom. The long-haul drivers, the road workers, the people for whom range and openness still mattered more than privacy. The slang hadn't disappeared, just thinned out. The handles were still in use, just attached to fewer voices. The accidents and construction warnings and road condition reports still came through, same as always. But the layer of four-wheelers and families and curious teenagers and strangers passing through, all of that had peeled away one household at a time over the course of a decade, following a different signal toward a different kind of connection. On April 28, 1983, the FCC officially abolished the licensing requirement for CB radio entirely. The announcement was a measure of how far the tide had already gone out. At its peak, the licensing process had been handling hundreds of thousands of new applications per year. By 1983, it had become an administrative burden with no matching benefit. Nobody needed the license anymore, and not enough people were asking for one to justify maintaining the system. The Commission described it plainly. The fad had faded. That phrase is accurate, but incomplete. Fads fade because they were never more than surface. What happened with CB radio was different. The surface faded, yes. The broader culture that had built up around it through the second half of the 1970s peeled away fairly quickly once the conditions that had created it changed. But the core use case, the practical highway communication network that had existed before the boom, that persisted. It persisted because it solved a real problem in a way that nothing else matched exactly. Open frequency. No infrastructure required. Voice communication across a span of road. No account needed, no subscription, no tower range to worry about. You can buy a new unit today for roughly $30. Turn it on somewhere near a major interstate and Channel 19 is still there. Still being used for the same things it was being used for in 1973. Road conditions, speed traps, accidents ahead. The occasional voice just talking to stay awake across an empty stretch of interstate at 2 in the morning, because the miles go faster when there's someone on the other end of the frequency, and the silence on either side of the road goes on for a very long way. The slogan was 6 words, 19 on the 19th. It moved Channel 10's traffic to Channel 19 in a single coordinated act. No authority ordered it. No regulation enforced it. No advertisement promoted it. It spread voice to voice across the open air because it made sense, because it solved a problem, and because the date aligned in a way that made it easy to remember and easy to pass on. That is how a convention becomes permanent, not through enforcement, through usefulness. And Channel 19 is still there. The next time you pull onto an interstate late at night and see a long-haul rig running ahead of you in the dark, that driver might be on 19 right now, listening for the same thing drivers have been listening for since the fall of 1973. Something useful, something true, something that comes through the static from someone you'll never meet who is moving through the same dark stretch of road you're moving through, watching the same lane markings disappear under the same headlight beams, and keeping the same channel open in case somebody needs to know what's up ahead. That's what 6 words built. That's what a date on a dial preserved. And more than 50 years later, it hasn't moved. If that brought something back, if you remember a handle you haven't used in 30 years, or a stretch of highway where Channel 19 saved you an hour, leave it in the comments. We read all of them. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and keep the shiny side up.